as uncomfortable as it may be, as uncomfortable as you think, hey, I'm just an engineer. Who am I to do this? I'm an introvert. It makes me feel uncomfortable. You got to get out of your box. You got to go talk to the customers. They're the users. They're going to tell you what the problem is.
Hey, my name is Felix Tia. I'm the host of the Culture of Code, where we bring on experienced engineering leaders, anywhere from software engineers to engineering managers to product managers to designers, to talk about their career and what has helped them to succeed in their tech career. In this episode, I'm joined by Michael Avrukin, engineering manager at Google, managing Google Sheets infrastructure and Sheets mobile team. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so tell us more about what you do at Google on the Google Sheets team.
Thank you. So my primary focus on the Sheets team is managing the core infrastructure team as well as the mobile teams. It's split about 80-20, 80% on the infrastructure side, 20 on the mobile side. The infrastructure team is the primary team that's responsible for the core, let's say, calculation engine, server-side infrastructure, and all of the machinery and tools that goes into building and shipping the Sheets product to our users. And as a result of that, we also become the primary team that's the most external facing to our enterprise customers. So when we're dealing with the Macy's of the world, the Capital Ones, the Air Asia's, pick, some of these larger customers, and they run into issues, we are the team that is usually in the front line of trying to figure out what's going on there, what are their challenges, and helping them resolve that. So that tends to be very technically involved project. To balance that out, I have my 20% on the mobile side where we get to do lots of fun features and launch, things that are much more fun and exciting. We move way faster on that team than we do on the infrastructure side. And so that keeps me balanced between those two types of projects.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's an overlap between the two teams, but it sounds like maybe a general observation is that there's the infra work and then also a product team that you manage too, which to me seems kind of unique where a manager, someone that's in charge of a team, has that kind of balance. Is that accurate? Is that a unique situation? Like, have you found that that's different or the same maybe throughout your other parts of your career where you have managed teams?
So I find that I personally need the balance because I tend to like to do different kinds of things. When you work on infrastructure projects, they're very long running. So unless you are very much like what I would almost describe like an academic type of personality where you like to work on something for 18 months without necessarily seeing the results, I think there are people who are like that. They're very academic in nature, and those are the folks who are very much in the infrastructure team. I personally like that work. I like the intellectual challenge, the rigor that's there. But at some point, I'm just like, oh, come on, I got to ship something. So I need this other thing to balance me out where we're able to move much more quickly. I think it's a balancing act. Some people are more like me. Some people are less like me. Some people like to just constantly be shipping. So they're much more on the product side. Some people like the infra side of things. They're much more on the other side. I tend to like to sort of balance the two sides. And I think it gives me a much better perspective in terms of the overall life cycle of the product, the user experience, the user journeys, the kinds of issues they have. And I wouldn't say I'm unique. I think this is somewhat common to some other engineering managers at Google and other places. But you're right. I think there is a tendency to focus on one versus the other, either infra or front end or whatever.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to this, which is that on product teams, there's much more emphasis on shipping. And I think maybe to some degree also much more maybe visible, the kind of work that goes out because it's a product team is going out to users in a lot of ways. How do you recommend that folks that are in their careers as that work on infra teams or product teams think about how their career can progress when you're on a team that is like shipping a lot versus an infra team, which has maybe longer development cycles where the fruits of your labor don't pay off immediately. They obviously pay off in huge ways, but it takes longer sometimes for it to reveal itself. Like, do you find that that's something that needs to be managed or you need to pay close attention to that as someone that's, let's say, like an IC in their career in infra versus products?
Yes and no. What I found is like this. So it depends on the organization, depends on the team. In some instances, you have cases where folks sort of look at the infrastructure projects and they say, oh my God, those are the folks who are getting promoted. So I'm going to go work on that. And they go and join the infrastructure teams. And within like 6 months, they're miserable. They just really hate the job because it doesn't fit their personality. It's not who they are. And then you have folks on the infrastructure side who are like, hey, I really like the fact that all those people are getting constant recognition. They're being talked about in the newsletters and all the features they're launching. I want to go work on the front end things. And then they go do that and they hate it because it's not who they are. They're like, they want to be able to think about problems a little bit more. They want to be able to invest in sort of more research. Their personality is very different. So I think you sometimes get swayed by the wrong things, the external forces, and you go away from what your natural talents and abilities are. So my guidance is like focus on what your best talents are, certainly initially in your career. Maybe you like to move more quickly, maybe you like front end things. I personally love developing front end features. Other people I know hate it. And then vice versa. Maybe some people like infrastructure work, they like very core meaty challenges. Now, how do you progress professionally? Because yes, you're right, you can become limited. If you're infrastructure side, projects take a long time to launch. If you're on the product side and the very much front end, so maybe you're constantly shipping and you never have a chance to demonstrate like, hey, I made this huge impact because it's a lot of small changes. So you want to be somewhat strategic, and that becomes when the more senior you become, the more cross-cutting the work becomes, and the more forward-looking it becomes. So the more strategic you can be in terms of your work. So even if you're in the front end and you're like, hey, like I'm constantly only shipping things that take 6 weeks to launch, you should probably find a way to pause for a moment and say, okay, well, if I was to potentially think about what are the kinds of things we're going to be shipping 6, 9, and 12 months from now, and you don't have to be precise, you don't have to be exact, but you can sort of forecast just a little bit out there, and you can think, okay, how do I articulate that roadmap? How do I think strategically about that? And then you can come back and say, well, there's some pieces I'm missing from the infrastructure side to enable that future success, or I'm running into particular issues in the infrastructure side. How do I enable that success? And so then you can come in there and say, how do I partner with the infrastructure side? How do I partner with product to tell that story? How do I partner with other folks to be able to lay those bricks into the future? And that's how you begin to grow professionally. And the same thing in the infrastructure side. As opposed to just sort of sitting there and like working on for a project for 18 months, you can sort of say, well, how do I tell the business story behind the next 3 months or the next 6 months? How do I articulate what we're going to be launching? How do I begin to plant the seeds for on the front end product side that they can start leveraging what we're building now or in a month or 2 months and not wait for 18 months from now? How do I begin to build those relationships? And then you become more impactful that way. So it's sort of like a bridging thing and becoming a little bit more strategic in terms of how you're thinking about your career.
Yeah, that's a great point about how the lines kind of start to get blurrier as you progress in your career, where you're not really siloed on what you're strictly great at, but then there's like an overlap between what you're great at and also what might be necessary for you to get to where your goals are. How do you recommend the actual engineers work with, let's say, their product managers or project managers to kind of craft this business story that you're talking about?
It's hard because I think especially in the beginning, you're going to hit a lot of failures. So I find that one of the hardest things that especially more junior engineers have is that they have lots and lots of ideas, and then they go to talk to the product managers, they grab a coffee, they grab whatever else, and the product manager is going to sit there and they're going to list you 75 reasons why your idea sucks. But that's just what they do. Like, it's their job. And then you get really discouraged because you're like, oh my God, like I have these ideas, but they're not hearing me. I guess I shouldn't be talking to them. You have to develop a little bit of a thick skin and sort of take that feedback and keep iterating and just keep seeding those ideas and keep seeding those things. And over time, you'll begin to sort of chip away at that wall and begin to hear their feedback, begin to change how you tell the narrative of what you want to do. And you do have to take some time out of your day-to-day job. If you're just focusing, I'm going to be honest about this, you're 10 to 4 in those hours and you're like, I expect to do my main job and also be able to be strategic and thinking, it's not going to happen. You usually have to find a little bit of a window where you're doing a little bit of extra work, where you're setting time aside to think about those strategic things, putting those proposals together, shopping them around, incorporating the feedback, and repeating that many, many times over until you finally get something that lands and resonates, and then you start building on top of that. But the hardest thing to overcome is that initial, like, no, and that initial, like, here's all the reasons why it's not going to work. Take that feedback, build on top of it, and iterate over and over and over again. By the time you get to like the 10th pitch, you'll be doing much better.
I like that it's an iterative process and not just like you're like pitching something and all of a sudden you either get yes or no. And if it's a no, you start from scratch again. It's
Yeah.
a very iterative. For you, do you have like a source of inspiration to even kind of plant the seed for these ideas? Like where do you typically look, or maybe at your scale, your
Yeah.
vantage point is different than more of an IC, maybe for an IC that is looking to start expanding their scope. Where do you recommend they look for sources of inspiration to come up with these bottoms up sort of ideas to present to like the team or product managers?
Yeah. This is a little bit hard because I understand that I have a particular bias to this, and that is that I tend to have a very good palette for where technology is shifting towards. To give a specific example, about 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago at this point, I actually pitched the Sheets team on beginning to move towards doing WebAssembly in terms of our backend infrastructure, just as an example. And it got rejected outright. People said, no, we're not going to do this. Here's all the reasons. I said, fine. And then we did some experimentation. We did a little bit of a prototype. It didn't quite work out. But then we kept at it a little bit more as a side project. And eventually it became essentially our main line of work. But I had that foresight. And at the time, everybody sort of looked at me like I was crazy. Like that was literally the reaction. Like, what are you talking about? This is not going to happen, right? It was two reasons. Number one, engineering managers at Google typically are not the ones who are pushing the new technologies. And number two, this is like way before the technology was ready. WebAssembly was not ready at all 4 years ago. And now it's in a much better state. So how did I get there? Well, I spent a fair amount of time just constantly reading. So I carve out time every single week. It's sometimes on Sunday, sometimes on Monday mornings. But I'm trying to stay in terms of like, what are the trends in the industry? What's happening? What are people talking about? And you're just sort of reading and reading and reading a lot. I think Warren Buffett put it this way, is that the best way to learn is essentially just to read. And he describes his job as most of the time he's just sitting there reading. And I think the same thing is true for engineers. You want to spend as much time as you can reading and sort of figure out what's happening in the industry. And then you sort of begin to form a pattern. Oh, these people are talking about WebAssembly. It seems to be solving this problem. Or these people are talking about Angular and it solves that other problem. Or they're talking about Vue or whatever the next thing that's on the front end. And you sort of begin to form that picture. And then you begin to understand that there's a problem we can solve, or there's some narrative we can do. And you sort of maybe experiment a little bit, maybe prototype something on the side, maybe do that, and then you go from there. That's on the technology side. On the product side, if you have a good product, if you have a product that has adoption, it's actually not hard. Just listen to your users. All you have to do, and this is amazing, I find this is incredible, you're going to get feedbacks from your users on a constant, ongoing basis. They're going to tell you, what they don't like, what they like, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. Listen to them, talk to them, get on a call with them and discuss it and be candid. And what you're going to find is incredible. You're not going to need more than 5 calls. I guarantee you more than 5 calls is enough. You're going to get a pattern of the things that they're complaining about. And you would be amazed at how many product managers don't do that. It blows my mind. Like I often tell product managers, what's the first thing you should do in a new team? Get on a call with the customer. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. I was like, why not? Well, we don't need them. We know what their roadmap is. I'm like, no, get on a call with a customer, talk to them, hear what they're complaining about. And if you're an engineer, do that. As uncomfortable as it may be, as uncomfortable as you think, hey, I'm just an engineer. Who am I to do this? I'm an introvert. It makes me feel uncomfortable. You got to get out of your box. You got to go talk to the customers. They're the users. They're going to tell you what the problem is. 5 calls is all it's going to take for you to get to a place where you form that picture of what their problem is, turn around, package it up nicely, present it to the product management, ship it, right? And yeah, they may not agree. They may have other reasons, considerations, but you'll at least have the data points and the thing to do. And so that's where you begin to craft that future line.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing because you've had a long career and you've probably seen the evolution of careers and different roles at companies. It almost seemed like for a long time was almost like the product managers or the gatekeepers to ideas, the gatekeepers to stuff that gets onto the roadmap. Did you see a shift at any point where it's now became more bottoms up and almost like entrepreneurial approach to software engineering where a lot of the ideas are now encouraged or maybe even adopted that come from the bottoms up
Yeah.
from like typical ICs?
So I'll tell you a funny story. I used to work with Adam Nash at LinkedIn. So not closely. He used to sit 2 desks away from me. We weren't on the same team, but Adam Nash is, he's a pretty big product management guy. I actually, funny enough, I sat with his dad on a board, it's all other story. But Adam Nash, when he left LinkedIn, said one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard. He said, the dirty secret of product management is that nobody reports to a product manager. And that really resonated with me because product management, in a way, is very much about the fact that you're leading without necessarily having the authority to lead the people. And Adam Nash, I don't think ever really defined the features that we need to be building at LinkedIn, but he had a very unique ability to inspire the engineers to come up with those features. He had a way of sort of setting the problem context, setting some of the issues there and getting us to that solution. And Jeff Weiner at the time had the insight of really we should be running these hackathons, which we did, which essentially allowed us as engineers to just sort of prototype an idea, throw it against the wall, and then present it to the whole company and see what sticks. And I think the point there being is that as an engineer, you're pretty close to the technology. You know what's the limiting elements. Product managers, if you're not close to the technology, you can come up with the most beautiful presentation, but if it's not buildable, it's not buildable. Or if it's going to take 10 years to boil the ocean, it's not going to happen. Engineers are pretty close, and so they have a good feel for what's there. Where did it begin to shift? I don't think it ever shifted. I think it's very much depends on the culture of the organization. LinkedIn was always very much both a product-led organization, but also sort of an engineering, sort of entrepreneurial type of organization, where the engineers were always given a lot of latitude to experiment, play around, prototype on the product side, not the infrastructure side. We suffered way many points on the infrastructure side, but on the product side, you were always inspired to, hey, play around, see what happens, see what sticks, let's see how we can get traction. Google, on the other hand, is like a very, very product-led organization in the sense that it's like, product management by PowerPoint or by slides. That's how I would describe Google. So effectively, if you can't craft an exceptionally designed slide presentation, you're not going to get it shipped. Like, it's just not going to happen. And I have plenty of stories of excellent things that wound up getting shipped behind the scenes that customers love, but that the product management just fought tooth and nail to not get them shipped because it wasn't on the right approved roadmap. And it's just a cultural thing, right? It really depends on the culture. And I think if you go to other company like Meta, they have a different culture for that. You go to Apple, again, different culture. I think it really depends on the corporate culture. And I think you need to find the one that works best for you. If you're not necessarily what I would say it's sort of like a creative type as an engineer, you're just like, hey, I just want to have my task list, I want to run with it and just build on it. Google's great for that. If you have lots and lots of creative energy and you have lots of innovative ideas, you want to try things out, Google might not be the right place for that. So somewhere else might be better. But it's just a cultural element of what the company's like, what kind of product management culture it has seeded.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you still got some things working where it didn't straight up come from product management, but it sounds like you had some ideas with WebAssembly, for example, and got it off the ground. You mentioned this. You mentioned the words proof of concept. Do you recommend that being an approach as building evidence for? I guess how do you use that tool of building proof of concept to get your ideas across the finish line?
So the way I like to define it is sometimes people talk about it as a minimal viable product. I like to think of it as a minimal viable feature. Like, what is that one thing you can build in a span of a day or 2 days to just demonstrate like the bare bones, like functionality or idea or concept? Like for us, for example, one feature we worked on for a little while was a filter by color, right? It's a very loved feature in Google Sheets. You can actually sort of tag your cells by color, then you can filter by color. The initial prototype literally took like 3 days to put together. And then we presented it to the product management team and say, hey, look at this really neat feature. They obviously said no. And then obviously it launched because they said no, whatever. It's a long story from there. But you want to find a way to sort of show something. You can't just sort of say, trust me, it's going to work. If an organization like Google is going to commit 10 engineers for 3 years, that is a massive commitment of time and money and resources. It's not going to do that based on your trust me, it's going to work. You got to find some way of measuring it. So the WebAssembly thing, what did I do? I actually forked a particular sort of benchmarking tool that somebody else created on GitHub, and then I adjusted it because I realized it wasn't done well. So I optimized a bunch of stuff in there. Then I showed, hey, look at these. Here's the JavaScript code. Here's the WebAssembly code. The WebAssembly is 3 times faster than the JavaScript code. We can do it this way. I pitched it. They said, yeah, we believe the numbers, but not going to work with our infrastructure. There was a bunch of other reasons. We tried to sort of get to something that worked, and we eventually did get to like a small prototype that sort of proved the concept. And then once we saw that, we're like, okay, we can see a glimmer of hope here. We can see that in their current path, we've essentially reaching the limiting function of what we can do with JavaScript. We need something else. And then the WebAssembly looked like the right thing, and then we did that, and that sort of enabled that huge next leap forward of things. But you got to get that small proof of concept, because if you don't have that, you don't have a feel for like what is going on in there. And like our initial experimentation with it actually showed that one of our biggest blockers was the fact that WebAssembly didn't have the right debug tools, it didn't have the right compile tools, it didn't have the right like workflow tools. It wasn't even for lack of desire on our end. It was actually effectively, we came to the WebAssembly team and we told them, listen, we'd love to use your tools, but we can't because we just don't have the right infrastructure. We don't have the right ecosystem. We're blind. So go fix that and then come back to us. And so we were able to give them feedback. And then that sort of became a little bit of a cycle. So, but we couldn't have done that without just doing a small prototype, at least getting something. And so I'm a huge proponent of just if you can prototype it in 3 days, in 5 days, in a week, you can do that. And this is something I tell all new managers, find ways to enable prototyping on your team. I guarantee you that when you're working on year-long projects, 1 week isn't going to make a difference whether you ship early or late. Nobody's schedule is that precise that if you're working on an 18-month long project, that it's so well planned that having an engineer step aside and do something for like, a week is going to throw the whole thing out of the window.
Oh, interesting. So
Yeah.
you almost recommend like proof of concept even before, let's say, planning or like really detailed scoping of a
Yeah.
project.
Just play around with it. Just figure it out. It's like, is it even going to work? Is it something that's usable? Get it into users' hands or even your hands or friends' hands or somebody. Sometimes if you do the filter by color thing and you're like, oh man, this really is, people are going to be able to use it as an example. Or you're like, oh my God, this is exactly what we needed, right? So it's like, it suddenly clicks. There's nothing like showing your end users what the product is like than telling them. It's like show, not tell. In writing, they always tell you show, show, don't tell, show, don't tell, right? Same thing with product. When you're building it and experimenting, show, don't tell.
And a big part of like, I guess, the inspiration behind this particular proof of concept and this push with the WebAssembly was that you mentioned that you stayed on top of the technologies and like specifically what they were solving. And you credit a lot of your success too as being on top of the kind of JavaScript frameworks and client-side development in your career. And during the time that you were more hands-on keyboard and actually in coding, there was a lot of changes almost like weekly, monthly with JavaScript frameworks and on the front end. I think that slowed down a lot in the time since. But how do you make sure that you are staying on top of things, but without like chasing the next shiny object and constantly being distracted from technology to technology?
Yeah. Okay. That's an excellent question. So, the number one thing to know is you want to be somewhat of a computer science historian. And I think that if you have a traditional computer science degree and you really sort of pause and understand it and think what you learn, you have a tremendous weapon versus folks who are coming in from non computer science backgrounds or coding schools or whatever it is. Why? If you have some of those core computer science classes in your background, one of the biggest things you're going to see is like, oh, wait a second. A lot of these ideas have been around since the 70s and 80s. There's nothing really all that new here. So you're able to pattern match fairly quickly what you're seeing now with what was there before. And you're like, oh, great. So now we have dependency injection in JavaScript or whatever else using, Angular. Great. That solves the dependency injection problem, which was solved 20 years ago with Java. Great. So it's like you can sort of pattern match very quickly. Do we need it in my current project? Not really. So it's irrelevant. Move on, right? So it's these kinds of things. You see, what's that new build framework? I can't remember. A build tool that just came out a few years ago. So everybody's running to use that. Well, it solves a very real problem with performance for building a lot of these applications. And so, okay, there's a new tool. How does it do it? Oh, there's a lot more caching. Okay, got it. I know what's happening there. So the more well-versed you are in the overall sort of like ecosystem of all of the things that exist in the computer science literature, the more you read, the more you do this, the less you get excited about the technology, and the more you just sort of like, hey, it's just another use case of that. It's an improvement on this. It is an optimization of that. And you're like, we can use that. Most of this is garbage. So that's the way that I tend to think about it. It's just,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah,
filter.
it's funny that we think about technology as always the latest and greatest new thing, new idea, but a lot of things get recycled over like 20, 30-year cycles. I think it happens a lot in the kind of database and schema world too, where ideas from the 70s and 80s all of a sudden become popular again
Yeah.
to solve use cases for today.
I'll give you a quick example in terms of the whole AI thing. A lot of people sort of looking at the ChatGPT side of things, and they're like, "Oh my God, new AI things." So now I spent the first 10 years of my professional career deep in the AI side of things, really excited about it. And then you sort of begin to look at the papers, and I think one of the early papers that work in it is something called support vector machines, which dates back to like the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Why, we still use those concepts of support vector machines even today, but why was it not popular? Well, we just didn't have the compute. So once we got to like, 2005, 2010, and you had AWS and you could spin up 10,000 servers to do the compute, so you could suddenly have that available to you. You could do what the theory said back then. ChatGPT is really just taking a whole lot of data and applying somewhat old methodologies for chaining things and for doing some of those probabilistic models in a really fast and efficient way. But underneath it, there isn't really that much innovation. So once you understand the technology, you're like, oh, okay, it's just the fact that it's hypey is because we've achieved a yet new milestone in terms of frameworks and compute cost and compute availability, not necessarily because the technology is like truly innovative and new. It's just building on what's been there before.
So when you are thinking about a new technology to employ or things, I guess, how do you balance between experimentation with prototypes and like ideas that are coming from the ground up versus like what's on the roadmap that our customer needs? Like, how do you balance between like what you should be focusing on?
It's a hard question. I think you always have to prioritize what the customer needs now. The reality of the day is, the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you do. Customer needs come first. And I think this can sometimes be really hard to swallow. But if there's a customer ticket, a customer escalation, even if you know that if you spun off a project 6 months from now, it would fix the underlying customer issue today, you can't pick up the phone and call the customer and say, listen, hang out there for 6 months. We'll get back to you. We'll be fixed. It's going to be 9 months or maybe even 12 months. But you can't do that. You have to find a way to address the customer issues today, whatever it takes. It's like that old, saying, the customer's always right. So this is what you got to do. But at the same time, you got to find those opportunities, as I said, early experimentation, to be like, okay, here's a yet another instance where the customers complained about issue X. Google Sheets, like for example, import range. Import range we know is a problematic feature because customers complain about it. They're really using it to the extreme. It's really heavy in terms of compute. And we're like, hey, it was originally designed like 10 years ago. It's really went way past what it was designed to do. We got to re-architect it. We got to redesign it. We got to re-implement it. And so you sort of try to figure out, well, how do we fix the customer's issue today? But at the same time, me as a manager, I go to my roadmap and I say, we got to have the hard discussion at our next planning session when we're going to say, we got to focus on this. We got to start fixing this problem. It's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And then you have to gather the data for your product management and say, hey, listen, over the last quarter, we've had 50 escalations related to import range. Quarter before that, it was 40. Quarter before that, it was 30. We are now spending 30% of our time dealing with import range escalations. If we don't dedicate resources to solving this problem, 2 quarters from now, 50% of our team is just going to be sitting there addressing customer tickets related to import range, right? So you got to be able to sort of demonstrate that and experiment and also show like, hey, this is what needs to be fixed. This is the investigation. We carved out one person from the team to spend a quarter to figure out what's happening there. They come back, they give their recommendation. You sort of figure out what needs to do. You obviously cut down some of the things. You try to optimize things, this whole cycle there. But you got to do the experimentation plus the balancing of the customer needs. And it's sort of back and forth.
Yeah, I want to talk about your observations about how the different roles within software engineering has evolved over time. I've been in the industry less time than you have, but even in the time that I've been in it, especially for like a generalist kind of role, it seems to have expanded in scope where there's less siloing. I think you still see this on the extremes where there's still going to be specialists, especially maybe on the mobile side. There's still like iOS or Android developers, and they're still focused there. But do you see now that there's more of a less of a need or less of a, I guess, almost like a job requisite for front end only or back end only? You see more full stack. What's your observation on how that's changed over time?
I think it's a matter of just technological maturity. So I'll walk through it again through a slightly different lens. When I started college back in the early 2000s, I'm sort of doing that side of things. So then very much, you're building things that were tools still. You're writing command line programs that process files and whatever else that they're doing. And then eventually they sort of said, well, maybe there's this thing called databases and maybe we should teach you about servers. And you did that. And it was still sort of back-endy. But nobody talked about front end, right? Because front end, who does that? It's like those fake people who do that, right? And eventually that evolved because that became the norm and that stopped being the new technology that people didn't understand. And it became the new technology that people did understand. And it became part of the overall toolbox that you had to know about. And yes, you were expected to be building front-end UIs of some sort for your projects and for your things. And that sort of evolved. And I think that's just going to become the general part of the ecosystem. Now, I think as a human brain, we can only hold so much information. So 30 years ago, if you graduated from college, you were expected to be able to go down to the assembly level and know the assembly level and be able to understand how, the differences between CPU architectures. Nobody cares about that today. It's irrelevant, right? Like we've shipped that out. Yes, there are people who do that niche, but we've essentially moved the stack up. So now you got to know your databases, you got to know sort of your server side and your front end, right? And then I think at some point it's going to move up as well. At some point, we're going to take things like databases and we're going to just say, hey, there's some storage thing back over there. You put the data in there, it sort of works. And when it doesn't, you pick up the phone and you call the database specialist, quote unquote, right? And so we move sort of more front end. At the end of the day, I think the biggest shift is that we realize that we have to empower engineers to be product owners and to be business owners, much more so than I think we used to. And I think we used to be much more like, hey, you're an engineer. Here's your tiny little bug that you're working on. You're sort of in this sliver. focus there and don't stray too much out of your guardrails. You go sit in your basement. And we've become much more like, hey, these engineers are pretty smart. We're paying them a lot of money. They have good intuition. Let's give them the ability to execute and figure out what needs to happen. And I think that's what we've come to. And I think it's just going to get more like that. And I think, no, my personal opinion is that over time, software engineers are going to become much more business minded. They're going to have a lot more business acumen and say in product direction and in revenue direction and in where things are, customers are headed. And they're going to have this slightly new breed of software engineers who are like, we really should be launching feature X because we think that's going to make us more money than feature Y that we're losing money on. So I think that's going to become much more of a thing than what we have now.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations if someone agrees with this projected evolution of the skills that are necessary to thrive as a software engineer, to have more of a business mind and maybe more metrics driven or maybe more analytics driven decision making? Do you have recommendations on how they can get on top of that to like prepare now for that kind of to be able to compete, I guess, in that way?
Unfortunately, my toolbox is limited in the sense that I always go back to like reading. And I think besides reading about technology, if you saw my reading list, it's huge. Sitting on my desk is like negotiating the non-negotiable, right? It's like this weird book. I have, Smart Brevity is a book I recently read. It was great. It's about more succinct writing. If you look at my bookshelf, it's sort of just full of different things. I read a lot of business cases as well. I read a lot about, biographies and autobiographies of folks who've been across various different industries. You can read the Carl Icahn type of thing. What's the guy's name from General Motors? He was General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. He was head of product for all three of them. But he wrote great books about product management and how to think about product. So read those, and it just gets your creative juices going in terms of like, oh, this is how I can be thinking about product. This is how we think about positioning. It doesn't have to be computer bound. It doesn't have to be software bound. You can be thinking about, oh, how do people create cars, and how do people do restaurants, and how do people do hospitality, and how do people do those other things? And it just gets your brain thinking in terms of what those other opportunities are. And then you can translate those ideas to how you're building your product. And I think that would be the best advice I can give, is just be broad-minded. The more you read, the more you understand, the more you talk to people, the more you touch, experience, and think critically about the world, the better off you'll be as a software engineer as well.
Yeah, that's a great point about how there's usually when someone's thinking about their career and they think about how do I advance my software engineering career, let me dive deeper into the technical things and dive deeper into my current domain. But a lot of the innovative ideas will come from borrowing from other industries, because that's truly a almost like a hack or a cheat to think outside the box by actually spending your time outside the box and reading material from other industries. I think that's a great point. And I'm not sure how many like monthly active users Sheets has now. I know Suites has billions of users. So you're managing it, has worked on a product, that huge product, complex product, globally distributed customers. What do you think are some of the kind of biggest misconceptions about the job that maybe internally people have about what you do and what your job is like, or maybe even that you had before you stepped into this role?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception people have is that, this is a funny story. My wife says that when she tells people what I do, is that they say, oh, so he's the person that like fixes my Google Sheet when it doesn't work. And she's like, what do you mean? She's like, well, I have this formula and it's broken, so can I send him an email? And she's like, he doesn't do that. Like, there's a running joke in the house that I am less technically competent in our own products that we build than my wife is. It's like it's a really funny joke because she uses Sheets more. She knows more about the functionality of it than I do as the person who develops it. So the reality is that no, we don't fix customer sheets. No, we don't look at customer data. Everybody thinks that we sit there and we're going to peek at your secret customer data and we're going to know exactly, what your business flow is. And they're like, we will not use Google products because Google knows exactly which customers I'm going after. I'm like, nobody looks at your data, dude. Like, we don't touch it. We don't look at it. We have no way of getting at it. It's like, but if one of us touched your data, we'd be walked out of the building, like by the end of the day, like fired. Like that's like the easiest way to get fired. So we don't do that. So that's probably the biggest misconceptions. In practice, I think the biggest misconception is that you get to sort of sit there and think about long-term strategy, and in practice, you don't. A lot of it is firefighting. A lot of it is mitigating issues in terms of customer escalations, which do have to be thought through, and a lot of it is dealing with lots of other teams and moving pieces and moving dynamics. It's a lot of like juggling a lot of balls in the air at any given moment in time, and I think there's always a fire waiting to break out somewhere else. and you're just trying to make sure that you stay ahead of those fires long enough to prevent the next one.
Yeah, speaking of this, like a misconception about, let's say, like data access, it seems to be like there's a growing distrust of like tech or tech workers, specifically over the last, maybe a couple of few years. Have you seen this before in your career? Like, how do you recommend people navigate it? Is it just something that comes up every once in a while where tech has been becoming so pervasive and with people seemingly to be talking to a human-like experience when they talk to Chat GPT? Like, what are your thoughts on this growing? I'm not sure if it's like distrust or just like wariness from the public or the non-tech world towards tech.
It's a hard question. I want to be sensitive to the issues there because I think it's not just a Google problem. I think it's hard to reconcile the reality of what you see in terms of like how Facebook does things or how Meta or how the Twitter did things during elections or other things. And on the one hand, you can say, yeah, they did everything right in terms of, the previous era of things, and or they're doing everything right now. And when you see sort of the internal discussions in the emails and the conversations, you begin to lose trust that these organizations are truly as fair as they are. And so I think that's where it comes from. For all of these organizations, and it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a Google, you're a Meta, you're a Twitter, Snapchat, whatever, pick. Every single day, you live off of the reputation of how your users perceive you. And you have an opportunity to either earn their trust and reputation and solidify your reputation as a data steward, as a guardian, as somebody who looks after, what your customers are doing and you're fair arbiter of your own policies, or you lose that trust. And I'll use the Warren Buffett line as well. It's like he says, it's a famous line from like 30 years ago. He says, there was a whole big case there where you had to step in with the bank. He says, you lose my money, I'll be understanding. You violate our reputation as a bank, I'll be ruthless. And it's the same thing for businesses, for these tech companies. And I think what happened is that they just took one too many actions that really undermined their reputation and trust that people had developed in them. And now they have to work to rebuild that. And I don't know what the solution to that is. I don't know if it's just a matter of time, whether it's policies, whether it's something else. But it's going to take time to rebuild some of that reputation and trust, because a lot of people don't trust them based on what they've seen and based on the actions. And I don't think anybody's necessarily malicious, or I don't think anybody was essentially bad. It just that the reality is that they overstepped their bounds a little bit, and they let the ability to do things that they did go a little bit out of hand. And I think there's going to have to be some course correction somewhere. I don't know what that is necessarily.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave on this note is that, speaking of the distrust we talked about now, maybe a lot of the fear mongering around AI taking over software engineering jobs, or maybe the layoffs in the economy. What keeps you kind of hopeful about the future of tech, hopeful about the future of a tech career for anyone that's just starting out in their career?
Did you read, what's his name? Packy McCormick has his Not Boring newsletter. Are you on his newsletter by any chance? You should.
I've heard of it, yeah, but I don't think I've read this one.
So you should sign up for it. So he did not this week, last week, he did a beautiful write-up about I believe it was him. Hopefully I'm not giving the wrong person, about the expansion of AI. And the fact that whenever we have a new technology, people are always fearful of like the fact that it's going to eat jobs. But what winds up happening is that the new time that's created because of new technologies invariably actually creates more work for people to fill that time up. So it doesn't matter how much free time you seem to create, somehow it always gets filled up with other work. So don't worry about it, you'll have a job. The other thing is that I think a lot of the AI tools that you're seeing, they're automating the really easy things. They're not automating the hard things. So the way I like to think about it is like, if you ever wrote C++ code, you have to write 50 lines to express a simple idea. And then Java made it, you only have to write, let's say, 25 lines because it gave you more libraries. And then if you found Python, you were like, oh my God, 5 lines of code, and I can parse this file and do all these crazy things, and it just works and it's easy. And my language of choice has become Python simply because I feel more productive in it. And I think AI enables that level of productivity. It gives you the sort of that next step of like, I can short circuit some of those sort of repetitive tasks and some of those repetitive things, and it can fill in the gaps for me, and it can automate some of that work. But as an engineer, it's not about writing a for loop. It's about building a system, and it's about building a product and understanding what those things are. And those tools aren't going to be able to intuit what needs to be built. They can't intuit what needs to be created. They can't intuit how a system should be designed and where some of the pitfalls are. And maybe one day they will. Maybe 20 years from now, you come in there and you say, build me a system that solves this, and poof, it's up and running. Could be. I don't think so. That miracle dream is yet to materialize, but it could, 20 years from now. But in practice, you still need to have good thinking and good reasoning and good software engineering skills. And you don't have to worry about maybe doing your one-off errors in your for loop because ChatGPT will take care of it for you, or whatever the other Copilot or whatever as the other tools are. But it's not going anywhere. On the contrary, having good software engineering background is only going to become more valuable.
Yeah, it
And
almost sounds like
knowing,
you see it as like another level of like abstraction, just the way that you
yeah,
saw,
exactly,
Ruby
yeah.
or Python.
I'll give you two examples. I think the biggest change for me is that I remember I used to use Visual Studio, and I thought that the autocomplete feature was the craziest thing ever. It was like it would make my life so much easier. And then I went to IntelliJ, and I was like, I will never go back to Visual Studio again because IntelliJ was just so much more powerful. It made me so much more productive. And yet, I remember there was this one person used to work in an office who used to use Emacs exclusively. He's like, I only use Emacs. And I'm like, but like you have this amazing tool, IntelliJ, like it does so much for you. No, I use Emacs, right? You'll have people who are very like staunch in that kind of way, and they'll just want to adopt the new productivity tools. So I think that's an important thing. When it comes to AI, that's another element is that you have to understand the limitations of the technology. You gotta have a good grasp of what the technology actually is doing, how it's working, what's behind the scenes, to understand what it can and can't do. A lot of times people are sort of throwing these questions or prompts at ChatGPT, and they're like, oh my God, look at how amazing it is. Or they're saying, look how stupid it is, right? Either way you want to sort of look at it. And the reason is because they just don't understand the tech, right? If you understood the tech, you wouldn't be impressed with either one. You'd be like, oh yeah, I understand why it's giving me good answers or why it's giving me bad answers, because these are the underlying limitations. And the only way you're going to get there is by really learning about the technology, understanding it, really digging in. And that requires education. That requires you being a good computer scientist and software engineer. And that's not going to change.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your
No
perspective,
problem.
Michael, and all of your advice. Again, Michael, engineering manager at Google. Again, appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your advice and sharing your journey with us.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Felix. Have a wonderful day.
And that's all the time we have for this episode of The Culture of Code. Join me next time to learn more from other experienced engineering leaders. Again, my name is Felix Tia. Take care.